You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello and welcome to Campus Talks, the Times Higher Education podcast in which we seek out insights from experts around the world to aid the work of academics and university staff. I'm Miranda Prynne, campus editor, and today I am exploring how institutions can support staff and students to make more environmentally sustainable choices day to day. Universities around the world are working hard to reduce and balance their carbon emissions, with many set on reaching net zero by 2030. This is a huge undertaking, requiring the modernising and refitting of university buildings to make them more energy efficient, switching suppliers, streamlining deliveries, reducing waste, rethinking catering across campus, moving to greener transport options. I could, of course, go on. But what sits at the heart of much of these efforts is a fundamental need to drive behaviour change across an entire campus community, usually amounting to many thousands of very diverse individuals. So, this takes in everything from encouraging researchers to embrace greener lab practices, something we explore in our latest Campus Spotlight Guide, to nudging the whole university population towards more sustainable food choices. Now, as we all know, changing deeply embedded behaviours can be very tricky, both at an individual and a collective level. So, how can institutions go about doing this to achieve their net zero goals without becoming too draconian and, put simply, irritating the hell out of their students and staff? To find out, I spoke to an academic expert in behaviour change relating to health and climate change. Esther Papies and her research team examine the social and psychological processes in the transition to healthier, more sustainable and more equitable choices. Esther is a professor at Radboud University in the Netherlands, where she moved in 2024 after 9 years at the University of Glasgow. And she has studied and published extensively on the motivations and barriers for reducing meat and dairy intake, the motivation for climate action among privileged individuals, and emotional experiences tied up with climate change. As you'll hear shortly, Esther provides a clear picture on what is needed to enact long-term behaviour change in favour of the climate and environment. And spoiler alert, a lot of it comes down to simply making it easy for people. But let's learn more from Esther herself. Hi Esther, great to talk to you.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on.
Well, it's pertinent timing as we are speaking on the eve of the Times Higher Education Sustainability Impact Ratings being announced. And for you in the Netherlands and myself in London, during one of our now not so rare summer heat waves, the temperature here is forecast to reach 38 or 39 degrees tomorrow. But amidst all this rather too real climate change happening around us, universities are racing to get to net zero. Many by 2030, which is actually just 3.5 years away now, which is quite a thought. And clearly this doesn't just mean sourcing more sustainable products for canteens or labs and offices, reducing waste, becoming more energy efficient. It actually does mean fundamentally changing the way their whole campus community conducts itself. And this, to me, seems like it might be the biggest challenge of all, but perhaps I'm actually wrong in that assumption. I wonder, how easy is it to change people's behaviour?
Yeah, great question. I mean, indeed, it will require a lot of organizational change to get universities to net zero, to reduce our emissions in line with the life-sustaining society. And it'll depend, as you say, not just on better procurement, although procurement is incredibly important. If we want to just bring down emissions For universities as organizations, I think a really good starting point is to look at buildings, food, and transport, as the IPCC also points out. So in terms of buildings, for example, you can think about, instead of new prestigious buildings being put up, how can you use the buildings you have and basically decarbonize them? How can you make them fit for the, as you pointed out, ever hotter future? So adapt also to the already changed climates, which is going to become less predictable in the future. In terms of food, universities are, of course, really important as a food supplier for lots of staff and students who eat there regularly. A really big challenge still, as we know in the food space, is to move towards more plant-based diets. And that is challenging in a space where meat is the norm, where eating animal source products is the norm, and where huge amounts of funding go to the livestock industry. This is subsidies that basically go into producing foods that we know are harmful for individual physical health, and they're harmful to the planet. So as one organization shifting away from that, of course, that is challenging. At the same time, universities are a really big consumer of food products with their catering. So it's also a really big opportunity to create change higher up in the system. It's a big opportunity for changing demand. And then transport is really important as well. Lots of people commute to universities. They use cars, but also public transport and active travel, cycling and walking. So commuting is a really important space, but also air travel, especially in the UK, where international students are a big source of income still, and controversial, but really important source of income in terms of student fees. We need to think about how we organize travel, also of staff going to conference, for example, doing field research, doing visits at other universities. It's become quite the norm to travel a lot by plane, to visit conferences, to fly to the US, to present a 10-minute talk. And a lot of people see it as a part of the job. It's basically a perk of being an academic, that you get air travel organized by your university. At the same time, just one return flight to LA will more than blow your carbon budget for a whole year. So the question is, really, is it worth it? And are there ways of organizing our scientific exchange in a way that is less harmful to our own future? And that takes away the basis of the work that we do. Because as some colleagues point out in a provocative research paper, no research on a dead planet, right? So first of all, we need to protect the basis that we have for life, and then we can think about how we do research in a way that doesn't hurt that basis. So buildings, food, and transport are important places to start for reducing our carbon emissions and carbon equivalent emissions, like methane from food, for example. But I think a great opportunity in this space is also to look at this more widely. And we should remember that in the climate crisis, we're not just consumers, right? We're not just consumers of food and air travel, for example. We also have other really important roles that we can use to create change. And that's been widely recognized now after a very influential paper by Nielsen and colleagues, that, especially higher educated people, so people who work in higher education, who receive higher education, and also higher socioeconomic status people who typically have a higher level of wealth and or income, have very powerful roles and responsibilities in the climate crisis. And this is, of course, because if you have more money, you have a higher, what we call, carbon footprint, or a lifestyle that's associated with much more in terms of emissions. So bringing that down on your individual level is really important. At the same time, you're also, like I said, not just a consumer, but also, for example, an investor. You're an organizational participant, and you're a role model to others. And universities are incredibly important as really prestigious role models that shape whole communities and that can showcase how change can actually work. So we shouldn't forget how universities invest money. Where a university is banking, are we banking with a bank, with a financial provider that invests in fossil fuels, that basically invests in products that destroy our own future? The USS in the UK is the largest pension fund. And it still invests heavily in fossil fuels. It invests in coal, for example. And that simply needs to change. And that will change only with pressure from members of the USS, from the pension funds, and pressure from universities. So those are also really important avenues for decarbonization and for becoming part of a safer and life-sustaining future that we shouldn't forget. And I think focusing just on net zero tends to make that discussion a little bit limited in a way, and it makes us forget some of the other opportunities also we have for change. We're actually breaching 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries. So it's also about biodiversity, it's about land use, it's about chemical pollution, water use. So I think we can think about this more widely and have a think about what is the university, what is the role of a university in a life-sustaining future? And how can we work on that now?
Yes, it's a very good point. It's always worth reminding ourselves that this isn't just about our carbon emissions. This is about a whole environmental outlook, looking at our planet, our own species survival, and the survival of all the others existing on this planet. You know, you mentioned that this shouldn't be limited to net zero. Of course, it's also worth saying net zero itself is somewhat controversial. There are a lot of people who say, well, it actually shouldn't be net zero. We should be looking at reducing emissions and not simply balancing them, which is obviously what net zero often means. So that in itself is subject to some debate.
Absolutely.
From what you described there, this is undoubtedly a monumental challenge, not just for universities, for everyone, but universities being such huge organisations with so many different instruments and types of work going on. It is undoubtedly a big challenge. But also from the way you describe it, all these different things going on, they also have a huge number of levers to pull, of course. So it also feels like a great opportunity if they can make the necessary changes across these different domains. Now, obviously, behaviour change, in particular in relation to health and climate change, is an area that you have really studied very extensively. But for those of us who are beginners in this domain, can you break down for us what are the key drivers of behaviour change, perhaps at a group level and an individual level? Because I'm guessing the two things do vary quite a lot.
Yeah, I think 2 really key things to keep in mind are to make the new behavior that you want to see possible and to make it appealing. And that sounds simple, and it's not always simple. And I can illustrate it a little bit in the space of food, where most of my research has taken place. So we know that cost and appeal are key drivers of food choices that people make, right? So if you want to choose, you're likely to choose a food because it looks good to you in the moment, and not because it's good for your cardiovascular health 20 years from now, and not because it's good for the planet or protects animal welfare for most people. And so what we see is that, a lot of people have some basic understanding that we need to reduce our intake of animal source foods. We need to eat less red meat, for example, especially because this is really high in emissions and is actually carcinogenic. At the same time, this is the food that's normative, that most people eat, that's very affordable, even though it has become more expensive, and that we know well. And so we have an expectation that it's tasty. And so what we see when we want to change behavior in that space is that, for example, in university cafeterias, it really helps to increase the availability of different options of plant-based foods, or at least vegetarian foods, but ideally plant-based foods. So having a lot of choice of items that are really appealing and that are really affordable really helps. So the affordability bit makes it possible to choose plant-based foods. And then you need to have the description, the labels of the food that show how the food is actually appealing. And the food needs to taste great. And so that you can choose it once, enjoy it, and then update your memory of it to anticipate an enjoyment experience again in the future. So working with those 2 drivers of increased availability at good cost of really appealing plant-based food is a way to work with those 2 drivers of making it possible and making it appealing and shifting people towards more plant-based choices. So we've seen in a lot of lab experiments, but also field experiments, that changing the kind of the choice architecture in that way really helps. And what's also important, of course, is the role of social norms. or kind of the anticipation of how other people will respond to your behavior, to your choices, right? So what we see in the space of plant-based foods is that a lot of people think that vegans are really radical. They don't care about the taste of food, and they only care about animal welfare and the environment, and they're very different from us. And we hear again and again from people who want to reduce their meat and dairy intake that they run into this kind of stereotype or meta stereotype that vegans also know other people have about them. And this is a real barrier to reducing meat and dairy intake. So we've actually done some research where we see that people think that vegans are so-called taste martyrs. So other people who eat meat and dairy really underestimate the degree to which vegans actually care about enjoying food, because vegans care about enjoying food as much as people who eat meats. And they do enjoy their foods, right? It's just other people don't expect plant-based foods to be as appealing, as attractive. So we've also seen that if we give omnivores, people who regularly eat meat, plant-based sandwiches, for example, that are on offer, or plant-based meals, they like them more than they thought they would. So they also underestimate the pleasure that they could get from plant-based foods. So again, appealing to enjoyment and showing people that actually the new behavior of the plant-based food, for example, can be really enjoyable, is a really good strategy to getting people on board. And then if the food is good, you can again build this habit of choosing it again in the future.
Yeah, interesting. So, because you mentioned earlier that universities are role models in many ways. So this feels like a good example that actually the role of perhaps social pressure is too strong a term, but certainly social expectations can be quite strong in driving behavior change. Can you kind of quantify just how big a role you think that plays? Like how much are people swayed by the behavior of those around them?
It's hard to quantify as an average, and it works in different ways for different people and very much differently in different situations. But one of the most effective so-called nudges to change behavior in one particular situation is the so-called default nudge. So basically, when you go into a situation, something is already pre-selected, you still have the freedom to change it, but most people just don't take the efforts. So if you go into a situation where you have a few meals to choose from, and the default that you're getting, if you don't say anything else, is the plant-based version, most people will stick with that. If you get a vegetarian pizza and you can add ham at an extra cost, most people won't, right? So that's a default. And the default is effective because it requires effort to change it. And most people, after all, don't care that much, it appears. But it's also effective because it communicates the social norm that in this situation, we eat a vegetarian pizza, we eat a plant-based meal. And the universities have a huge role in communicating that from now on, we understand that producing meat is a huge driver of carbon emissions, of environmental degradation. We're going to take the lead in changing this. We're going to set an example of how we can have wonderful food in great communities that doesn't hurt our future. And creating and communicating that expectation can be really powerful for driving change. Also, because it ties in with what people actually value. Most people care about the climate crisis. Most people are worried, especially young people are worried. And they endorse statements like the future is frightening, humanity is doomed, people have failed to take care of the planet, and even I'm hesitant to have children. And I think that's really scary, and it's an intergenerational injustice that is happening. And it also tells us that if we provide an environment where we can make better choices, future-proof choices, so to say, people will endorse them. So universities can really safely, I would say, take the lead in this. And so maybe sometimes it takes a bit of courage to make a start. I can fully understand that. But if not now, then when? I would say, certainly in the midst of a heat wave. And maybe one other piece of science that might comfort a hesitant decision maker in this space is that research on policy implementation shows that people tend to overestimate how much they will not like a policy once implemented. Once it's implemented, they tend to see the collective benefits of the policy and then they tend to be much more okay with it than they anticipated before the policy was introduced. So it takes just a little bit of courage from decision makers to create that system change at their organization, at the university, to make these better choices easier, to introduce that plant-based default, to introduce maybe a personal cap for air travel, and to change the promotion criteria in the way that we don't incentivize air travel inadvertently because we want everybody to have these international engagement. Well, you can have them on Zoom and still have a lot of impact, and nourish your networks that are more local, for example, and more local impact. But it takes that little bit of courage. But I would say once you find that courage, you will find the reward from people actually appreciating that you took the lead in this, that you leave a legacy of creating a university that's a part of a life-sustaining future. I think in the end, that will feel much more meaningful than having yet another paper and having an H index that's just that little bit higher. Knowing that you have been part of this movement creating a life-sustaining society will be a much more rewarding and will be appreciated by people around you in a way that maybe we don't always fully understand because we don't talk about it quite as much as would be fitting given our levels of concern.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right on just having the courage to lead and push through things that in the short term might not be hugely popular with absolutely everyone. It's like you've got to push past just a few negative headlines, and actually in the long term, often everyone simply adapts. There are many examples of that in the past. And even on a micro level, actually, I went to a music festival a few years ago. It's one I've gone to regularly, and they took a position where they chose to have absolutely no meat, and all their food at this pretty large event would be plant-based. And even just anecdotally, I had a few friends who, love their bacon sandwich in the morning, who were sort of semi-jokingly, but, slightly outraged, saying, I can't believe it. I don't think I want to go anymore. Actually, the moment everyone was there, everyone agreed by the end of it. The food was delicious. No one felt they were missing out at all. It was a really good kind of micro example of that happening in practice, that initial rejection of something, and actually when it happens and when you experience it, it's absolutely fine. It's not to the detriment of your life at all. Taking kind of broad view of all of this, given everything you've described, how rational do you think people's choices tend to be on this? Do you think ultimately the decisions we make are fairly emotional as humans? I mean, people always say we're led by our hearts and not our heads. Is that a truism, or is it more complex than that?
Yeah, I guess a lot of what we do is habitual behavior, is behavior that has served us well in the past. So it's relatively automatic. It doesn't require much conscious thought or much effort. But that doesn't mean it's not rational in the sense that it's behavior that does serve us well, right? So, for example, we eat roughly the same food every day as we did before because we know we like it, because we can prepare it, and we know that, and because we can afford it, right? So I would say in a way that is rational, but it has become relatively automatic. So it's a habitual behavior. At the same time, for changing behavior, it's not really enough to work with just the head. You also, as you say, you also need to appeal to people's values and what people actually, what appeals to people, like I described, for example, in the case of food. And I would say in the climate crisis for behavior change, we do need a little bit more information. I don't think the public in Europe fully understand the scale of the disaster we're headed for, nor do policymakers fully understand this. So providing more information, really appealing to this rational aspect, to providing more knowledge, appealing to the head is really an important basis. But it needs to be done in such a way that it doesn't numb people, that it doesn't make people feel powerless. So it needs to come along with things that we can do. So when we read in the news, for example, about the heat wave that is currently happening, and that is actually incredibly frightening. When we read about this, we need to tie it to where it's actually coming from. So not just saying it's part of the climate crisis, but it's part of the fossil fuel industry and the livestock industry that is creating the climate crisis. So what does this mean for us? What can we actually do about it? And then give people perspectives on helping to create change. I mean, I think this is incredibly important also in the university context. So we have done some research at Radboud University, where I'm at the moment, among students, and asked them about their experiences about talking about climate change And what would help them talk about it more? Because we know that it's a concern. And we also know that sharing your concerns is a good buffer for maintaining good mental health. And we found that the students reported that they didn't really talk about it much at all because it's so negative. There's nothing positive that they can share. They didn't see opportunities for engaging with climate change in a constructive way. And that is really a shame because there are so many things that we can do. And so providing opportunities for action, giving people ideas for involvement, for getting involved with organizations, for helping divest from fossil fuels, with creating change in university cafeterias and joining organizations that really are part of this turning away from the status quo and help create this new world. That is where we focus more on well-being and not just on ever increasing production and ever increasing consumption. That can be really helpful for people. So not just reporting on the facts, but linking it with the background, with, for example, where the emissions are coming from, what is causing the climate crisis, but also with what we can do about it. And that can be motivating, right? And that can give hope. And hope is a really important emotion in these difficult times where, of course, we're seeing a climate crisis, a planetary health crisis with a breakdown of biodiversity and increasing levels of pollution. And most people care about this, but people also care and are scared of other crises that are happening at the same time. For example, war and fascism, violence against women. All these things, of course, are happening, are scary and are interconnected because the climate crisis is also a reason for war. When food shortages arise and migration starts, social unrest is happening. All those things are linked. When temperatures are getting hotter and when livelihoods are threatened, violence against women increases. And those people who contributed least to the climate crisis are hit the hardest. So this is people of color and people in the global south, for example. So it's very much linked. It's a crisis of global injustice, but all these different facets of it are linked. And I think at universities, we also have a responsibility and an opportunity to join the dots and to empower our students with understanding this and then working where they are and what they care about to fix and address these systems that are leading to these injustices, where climate and biodiversity laws are just one of those many facets, basically. So I think, giving that sense of empowerment that you understand how things are actually joined up is also really important.
Yeah, and that absolutely makes sense. I mean, there's no doubt when one feels completely hopeless, it's incredibly demotivating. Whereas, as you say, hope energizes and it motivates. And it's a really good point that, of course, tying these very visible and very disturbing things going on in the world to the clear knock-on effect of a changing climate and everything that brings with it, but also to the actions that can be taken, because there is so much that can be done. But it is also, let's face it, it is quite easy to feel quite hopeless amidst this great existential crisis that we're all facing. So, I mean, I know, and you've referenced the fact that a lot of your work has looked specifically at changes to more sustainable dietary choices and reducing meat eating, dairy consumption, and so on. And you've talked a bit about some of the key findings in terms of what best motivates change in that arena. But I wondered if we could perhaps apply some of the lessons you've learned to a different challenge. So, for instance, if a university wanted to persuade their staff and students to stop using their cars and get to work using public transport or bikes or whatever options are available, what should they focus their efforts on to try and make that happen?
I think, again, we should look at how to make it possible and how to make it appealing to not come by car, basically, for the people who drive. If you want people to cycle, of course, this starts with a safe cycling infrastructure. This is not paint on the road. This is not the little bubbles that we got on the roads during COVID, during the pandemic, to help people cycle more. This is actually physically separated cycling infrastructure. So a university will have to work with the local council to make that happen. On the university campus, of course, you want to have places to leave your bike, places that are safe, that are nice, that are central, and that make it really visible that this is a place where we cycle, to kind of create that social norm that cycling is expected here. We also at universities often provide parking spaces that make it look really prestigious to come by car because they're close to the nice, fancy, important buildings. But actually, wouldn't those be beautiful green spaces where we can have trees and benches and flowers and a fountain and a little place to get really good coffee so people can hang out there and enjoy that space instead of that being a parking space? So basically, remove cars from campus. If you have to drive for disabilities, of course, there needs to be arrangements for that, but that's really the minority of cars that we see on campus typically. So turn those into beautiful green spaces so that people see that actually that benefits everybody. That will make it much more difficult to oppose that kind of change. But then, of course, not everybody will cycle or can cycle. Sometimes it's too far or it's difficult for other reasons. So you also need to provide alternatives. And so that would require an assessment of the public transport alternatives. Are they good enough? Can you work with the council to improve them if not? And otherwise, why not introduce your own electric shuttle to go through the neighborhoods where you know that your staff live and basically take them to work? But it needs to be nice, right? It shouldn't be a second-rate bus. It needs to be a good alternative to going by car. Our behavior is driven by expectations of rewards, of anticipated benefits. So when we think about going by car, for a lot of people, this means I'll have a bit of time to myself. I can turn on the music. I will be in my own space, and it'll be a good drive. It'll get me right to where I need to be. That's a positive simulation. People have positive thoughts about that. Often when we think about going by train, it sounds like a hassle. It feels like a hassle. So that's what we need to work with. We need to make it easy, pleasant, affordable, and really effective to get places in other ways. So that depends, of course, on every campus, on every university community, but those should be the basic principles. And you really, because commuting behavior is potentially a habitual behavior, you do it often in the same context, right? Those are the features of habits developing. So the new behavior using active or shared transport needs to be really positive so that you can update your representation and then do it again so it turns into this habit. If it's not pleasing, if it's not appealing, if it's not a good experience, it won't turn into a habit. And I understand that there's social and infrastructural challenges along this, but I would see it as part of creating a university that is future-proof, that is part of a society where we focus on well-being and not just on growth, on ever increasing production and consumption, but where we look ahead and think about what is our role in a society that is actually life-sustaining.
Yeah, there's definitely a theme around the fact you have got to make these more sustainable choices pleasant. You know, people don't want to feel it's a sacrifice to their own well-being or lifestyle. That comes through strongly on any of these choices. I just wonder, though, taking the example of stripping away the car parks and replacing them with lovely green spaces, which sounds delightful to me, but then I'm somewhat biased because I really don't enjoy driving. So you're preaching to the converted in my case. But I know for some people, I've seen it here in London where we've got the congestion charge and a lot more effort's been made to accommodate cyclists. Some drivers would see that as being at the expense of the roads for cars, and it's definitely created quite a lot of anger among some parties. Are there some actions that can almost inadvertently trigger resistance to behaviour change? Can this be pushed too far? Do you see examples of that? And perhaps how can that be avoided?
Yeah, for people to accept policy, it needs to be perceived as fair and effective and not too restrictive in the sense that people really feel it's imposing and is limiting their personal freedom. At the same time, a congestion charge, still gives you the option, but it basically shifts the cost to the polluter, which most people perceive as fair. So often, it's also a matter of communicating effectively around these choices. We've seen in research that the ultra-low emission zones especially have been incredibly effective in improving public health. So the admittance to hospitals from asthma attacks, for example, is one of those indicators where you just see that air pollution is a key driver of health problems in children. And if you can contribute to reducing that, who would object, right? So it's also about often communicating co-benefits of policies. If you only focus on the hassle of not being able to go by car, I can understand that that's not very appealing. But often, if we communicate co-benefits of different policies, this increases policy acceptance in the sense that people see what it delivers for them and for their community, because people actually do care. And children's health is something that is incredibly important to most people. And even people who don't have children strongly endorse statements like we need to protect the planet for future generations. So that is really a deeply ingrained, deeply felt value that most people hold. So working with those kinds of co-benefits can increase policy acceptance and help us work around potential areas for resistance. Often it can be really important to engage early on with the experiences of the community where we're trying to engender change. So, for example, if you're looking at changing the catering offerings in a cafeteria at the university, try to find out what people value at the cafeteria, why they go there and what they're looking for, and also speak with the staff. Really important. If you're going to introduce a new catering policy and the staff who are working in the cafeteria, they're not on board, they don't endorse it, it's not going to work. They will be the ones selling the food that you want to get out there. So really engaging with them, seeing what their concerns might be with a new policy, taking them seriously, giving them voice, and co-designing the changes with those who on the ground have the most expertise is a really important way to engage with the community.
Yeah, so this can't just be a top-down endeavour. Leaders, in inverted commas, have got to be willing to learn from the different departments and specialists within the university as to how, in these different areas and different contexts, this is going to work best.
Yeah, leaders need to create the opportunity to make these changes and maybe give the task, but the implementation is going to depend very much on those with the most expertise about where actually it's going to happen. Yes, and this will often involve different groups than maybe university senior management has worked with in the past. But to create a just transition where everybody is on board, everybody needs to have a voice in this.
Yeah.
The idea of fairness, I think, is also really important here. Especially in the context of the climate crisis, we really see that those with the highest levels of wealth and income are responsible for an outsized amount of emissions. They really produce most of the problems. And at the same time, they have the most resources for using alternatives. So basically, it is really fair to ask the polluters with the most resources to change their behavior. But selling those policies in a way that works with what's in it for them is then also really important. So that is not just seen as really restrictive, but appealing to co-benefits and to shared values and to ideas, for example, such as leaving a positive legacy and being part of creating a better future for your own children can be really motivating there as well.
Yeah, taking that on to focus on academic careers themselves, because I'm slightly haunted by your comment that one return flight to LA blows your annual carbon budget. I mean, that's quite a terrifying thought, given how many people do just hop on planes here, there, and everywhere for all sorts of reasons. And as you say, academia is pretty prolific because it's an international endeavour. But then taking into account everything we've said about needing to make these choices of behaviour change, because it is ultimately at an individual level a choice, make them appealing, make them feel fair, make them feel worthwhile, I guess, for that individual. You've already referenced incentives, but what else might be done to change the norms for the ways that academics have an expectation of global travel or feel that they need to, possibly?
Yeah, this is a big challenge, I think, at the moment for universities. And I know that lots of universities are trying to figure out solutions. I think we need to do that not only at universities, but also within scientific communities, with professional organizations, to come up with ways of organizing conferences differently, for example, organizing them in places where you can travel without having to fly. But also, I think here a little bit of more information might be really helpful, so that when you book a flight, you are aware of the emissions that come with it. And in France, actually, a lot of labs, a lot of university departments have personal budgets, carbon budgets for travel. And then you still have the choice to go, but you'll go to fewer conferences, but you will value the ones you go to more. And then you'll have to find ways of engaging with your colleagues in different ways. I think a really important consideration here is, again, the social justice argument. Most resistance in this space comes from more senior academics. And those are the ones that fly the most, whereas actually they need it the least. Early career academics still need to build their networks. They still need to visit other universities and need to go to conferences and present their work to, basically to still establish themselves in the field. So I think from a social justice perspective, if you're more senior, you should fly less and not more, and allow ECRs to basically use those carbon budgets to fly. So that's part of a wider conversation that we need to have at universities, also around, like I said earlier, promotion criteria, how we incentivize international travel. Are there ways that we can engage with international communities without flying there? And if you do fly, which sometimes is inevitable and can be incredibly useful, try to combine different types of visits. So you go to a conference, you visit a lab, you visit other colleagues, and you make it an extended research visit, so that you don't just fly for that one brief talk, but you make it a longer research stay. So basically you get the most out of the emissions. And in a way, isn't that how we treat money? That we try to get the most out of it, right? And I think we have limited money, we have limited time, and we have limited carbon left to spend, very limited actually. So one basic principle that would be really helpful is to bring carbon or the impacts on the planetary health into every decision that we take at an organization like a university. So with every investment, think not only about the time and the money, but think about the carbon. Give nature a space at your table when you take important decisions. How will that change the process? So bringing that into organizational decision-making practices, I think, can be really eye-opening and provide procedures so that it's not an ad hoc or after-the-fact considerations. Oh, what about emissions from air travel? And that way you can really embed sustainability considerations into the fabric of your organization.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought in the analogy of a financial budget, because that's the first thing I thought of when you talked about this. It absolutely makes sense. Organizations are very effective at prioritizing how they spend their money. So if you make something finite, give someone a finite amount to work with, we can all prioritize pretty effectively in those circumstances. But of course, if it's unlimited and you're not forced to think about it, you probably won't. It strikes me that an awful lot of this is about communication. Communicating the cost of what people are doing, communicating the benefits of what they could do, communicating the benefits of what is being done, where you talk about social justice or improved health in terms of, for instance, transport changes or indeed dietary changes, trying to demonstrably show people that they're actually gaining from this as they're doing it. Because I think there's often a missing part there. People don't realise that they're benefiting even as they are, because it's not necessarily, immediately obvious to them. If it's, for instance, an improvement in their respiratory health, they might not notice within a day that they're breathing better. To end perhaps on a more individual note, for all those listening who might be pursuing personal goals of their own, whether that's getting fitter, eating better, wasting less, what's your advice for successfully nailing long-term sustainable behaviour change? How should we approach such individual goals? I realise that's a big question, but perhaps some key highlights.
I would say the key things will be to be kind to yourself and remember to make it easy and make it nice. If you don't enjoy doing it, you won't stick with it. And this goes for any dietary goal. This goes for exercise. Find the exercise you love. Find the physical activity that makes you happy and that makes you want to go again. And this also applies to any action within the climate space. Find others to do it with you. Find a community. Find the meaning that gives you joy. And then you'll be able to turn it into a habit.
Yeah, that's great advice. Well, Esther, thank you so much for speaking to me today. I hope you're able to stay as cool as possible in the coming days.
Thank you. Thanks so much for great questions and having me on. Thank you.
That conversation leaves me both more hopeful and slightly more terrified in relation to the climate crisis and what's needed to address it. There is hope in the sense that ultimately the behaviour changes needed are achievable, and if change can be enacted at a mass population level, especially among the more privileged, it will have a huge impact. But it is also undoubtedly very scary to confront how much of a problem air travel, for instance, actually is, and consider how ubiquitous car use or red meat eating are in many places, and the urgency with which we need to change these habits as the catastrophe that is rising global temperatures is already unfolding. But Esther's advice can ultimately be distilled into a few really helpful key messages. Make the changes easy, make them appealing, and where changes are perhaps felt to be imposed, try to make it as clear as possible to people before, during, and after how they and those they care about are benefiting. If you're looking for advice on other aspects of improving sustainability across your university, we have reams of insight from experts around the world, which you can find at timeshighereducation.com/campus if you head to our Sustainable Development Goals section. We also have the Spotlight Guide I mentioned earlier, focused specifically on reducing emissions and waste across research laboratories, published last week, available on the site. So that's it for this week. If you enjoyed the podcast, please do like, share and subscribe. You can find many more episodes of Campus Talks covering topics from what it takes to be a good doctoral supervisor to designing assessments that serve learning and everything in between, all on campus. Again, that's timeshighereducation.com/campus. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.